We all know and admit that film art has a greater influence on the minds of the general public than any other art. The official guardians of culture note the fact with a certain amount of regret and uneasiness. But too few of us are sufficiently alive to the dangers that are an inevitable consequence of this fact. Nor do we realize clearly enough that we must be better connoisseurs of the film if we are not to be as much at the mercy of perhaps the greatest intellectual and spiritual influence of our age as to some blind and irresistible element elemental force. And unless we study its laws and possibilities very carefully, we shall not be able to control and direct its potentially greatest instrument of mass influence ever devised in the whole course of human cultural history. One might think that the theory of this art would naturally be regarded as the most important field for present-day art theory. No one would deny today that the art of the motion picture is the popular art of our century. Unfortunately, not in the sense that it is the product of the popular spirit, but the other way round. It is the sense that the mentality of the people, and particularly of the urban population, is to a great extent the product of this art, an art that is at the same time a vast industry. Thus, the question of the films is a question of the mental health of the nations. Nevertheless, too few of us have yet realized how dangerously irresponsibly we have failed to promote such a better understanding of film art. Bella Bellaz, Theory of Film, 1953. Most social theorists would agree that cinema is a powerful artistic medium. Film can be seen as either a rich artistic interpretation of reality or a powerful and threatening manipulation of reality. While I have introduced this long-standing debate into this text, I find generally taken a definitive position to be irrelevant to my larger argument. Thus, the reader should not expect an argument that either position in this work. Rather, the mention of this debate is intended to illustrate a complexity and density that informs the art and the study of medium itself. As social theorists, these two general understandings of film as an artistic medium limit our sense of cinema in commenting on the social and political worlds. In other words, it is necessary to identify the form and function. The film form represents the general system of relationships among the various parts, while the film function is the role or effect of any element within the film's form. Bordwell and Thomas, Film Art, 1993. A film as a social phenomenon. In order to expand the interpretation, there are a variety of competing film theories, including genre, amateur, psychoanalytic, Marxist, feminine, of the medium, and use specific films or genres of film in asking whether one can use film as a specific form of communication in order to understand, to critique, or imagine better U.S. democratic politics in a way that both respects and transcends difference lines. In essence, our general understanding of cinema needs to include film as a vehicle that enhances social and political analysis as an alternative form of democratic communication, in addition to the dominant dichotomous interpretation of film as a realistic or artistic medium. The political companion to American film, Crowdis, 94, page 89. This suggestion is not without controversy. Sari Thomas, in her work Film, Culture, Explorations of Cinema in its Social Context, 1982, explains how science, including political science, seeks clear and certain answers, a practice she finds incompatible with the film study simply because cinema, like art generally, may present a variety of interpretations, some of which may conflict with one another, that cannot be presumed to reach in a definitive conclusions or a point of rational consensus. Solworth in Pictures Can't Say Ain't in 1982 concurs with Thomas. Paintings, movies, televisions, or sculptures cannot either be true or false signs, and therefore they cannot communicate the kind of statement, the meaning of which can be interpreted as true or false. Worth, 1982, page 97. By agreeing with Thomas and Worth's assertion that film cannot be read in a way that communicates the kind of statements that supports a true or false dichotomy, critics may ask, what film can be, if not a true or false statement? The answers may at first appear to be the avoidance of the question. However, what is important for this project is a movement away from a conventional understanding of rational argument and thus right or wrong, true and false. Specifically, film can be an expression of experience and telling of narratives that or have been excluded from the dominant culture of politics, attempting to conceptualize film narrative solely in a way that screams for a linear projection. One that rejects a complex and unstructured storytelling only works to affirm a dominant politics that often changes the other with an irrational or an inability to argue or persuade within the framework of a dominant discourse. Often this poses serious problems for traditionally trained political scientists. This does not, however, lessen the importance of cinema in our social and political analysis. Film is inextricably entwined with our social and political institutions and should be studied and utilized as a social science as a tool to better understanding of society. For example, films like Primary Colors, USA, 1998, and All the President's Men, USA, 1976, captured for many people real politics. And in films like Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, USA, 1979, with its overwhelming cinema experience, an experience that transports the moviegoer to a place where this conception of war is best represented as a monstrous threat to the soul. Along with Oliver Stone's Platoon, USA, 1988, has given the Vietnam War its definitive dramatic shape with Oliver's in American pop culture. These two films and Stone's directions particularly blazed a path for a new wave of films engaging in Vietnam experience that Hollywood and the rest of the country had repressed. Reigniting a national debate over war, other films like John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, USA, 1988, and the documentary Hoop Dreams, USA, 1994, provide a glimpse or a snapshot into the violent and complex environments of urban corridors in the United States. These films and others position the moviegoer as an eyewitness to a cycle of poverty, violence, and alienation. That is, moviegoers who may not have experienced firsthand certain historical events and conditions do so in important ways. Although such films often influence our social perceptions or other human sensibilities and our political institutions, they foster public dialogue and uncover stories, both real and interpretive, that have been repressed or not known. Cinema presents political and social, cultural messages and challenges that affect how people think and feel. Film requires our attention. If we believe, with Balaz, that film represents an important element in our socialization, our cognitive process, and warrants our attention to its conventions, then a pattern used by filmmakers to communicate meanings to audiences. The conventions of film take on a special significance for the social theorists who critically examine U.S. politics. The positioning of the camera, the placement of objects in certain shots, the lighting, the dialogue, the plot structure make up all important structural elements contribute to the overall dialogue of communication or cinema. Carey, 1982. The rose-colored window that distorts the world versus the accurate reflection of reality. Debate resides here in a discussion of film conventions. These conventions inform our questions about socialization, imagination by identifying a major debate within film theory. Rudolf Arnheim, Film as Art, 1957, suggests that film structure is tied in some innate fashion to visual reality. Worth disagrees. Visual conventions are social pacts negotiated between those who create communications and those who receive them. Carey, 1982, page 119. Worth's understanding is intriguing because he presents film as a dialogue between these who create films and those who view them. All of this without arguing for an accepted reality. The split between Arnheim and Worth does not, however, lessen the importance of film in our social and political discussions, nor does it suggest that we should abandon our consideration of the power of film that informs our cultural values, perpetuates our moral norms, and instructs all of us in the viewing audience of the rules that govern social behavior. Sobchak, 1982, page 148. Instead, it illustrates a rich debate between those who view film as a realistic depiction of the world and those who understand film as a rich and powerful artistic interpretation of reality. This division is not unlike one I have described for Chapter 1, where a dominant faction in society is convinced of the existence of a rational consensus on the basic social and political values that both reflects and makes possible the attainment of fair and just politics. One that opposes those who suggest a recognition, a tolerance, and an acceptance of different interpretations of reality, politics, and political theories. Specifically, there are different forms of art that is, like art generally, political science too presents a variety of interpretations and understandings of what constitutes the world around us, a form of reality. However, some interpretations resonate more strongly and offer a rich and more compelling argument that may suggest and lend to a transformation in how we see ourselves in relationship to others, and to a perhaps new and unnoticed bias for changing our politics. With this in mind, the film viewing experience should be understood as a collection of a variety of elements: the physical characteristics of the setting, the social characteristics of the moviegoer and activity, and social and political characteristics of the moviegoer that require consideration when employing film and justifying the use of a social science. Linton, 1982. Film theory maintains a richness in its attention to the physical features of the viewing experience and a clarity in its differentiation of film viewing experience vis-a-vis that of television. Tudor, 1969, Noble, 1975, Taylor, 75, Cook, 76, and Linton, 82. Considering these elements allows us to understand as best we can the complexities of the viewing experience and how best to apply cinema to a discussion focused on a difference of democracy, including in the cinema-going experience is a darkened theater that allows for a heightened intensity of message stimuli with its large screen, high picture resolution, and sound clarity. This experience provides for an increased sense of social isolation. That is, an isolation that brings on an increased, relaxed posture that makes the message more salient with the moviegoer, Bell Hooks writes, whether we call it willing suspension of disbelief or just plain submission. In the darkness of theater, most audiences choose to give themselves over, if only for a time, to those images depicted in the imaginations that we have created those images. Hooks, 96, page 3. I agree with Hooks, however, that imaginative possibilities are more complex and deserving of a richer description, something other than giving oneself over, if film is to truly be considered as a vehicle that can transport one's sensibilities from one place to another, from a place where one does not know difference to one where he or she somewhat does, then it is important as a construct to the self to another place constructed by different experiences and perceptions. In other words, I am suggesting one see film as an incredible and strong imaginative and emotional transporting or migration to the self. Thus the viewer finds him or herself susceptible emotionally to the stimuli, the alternative form of argument, than is the case with television or other visual media. Tudor, 96. Also, most of us do not consider the cinema experience as to be isolated one. Rather, The social characteristics of the moviegoer activity also include some sort of community interaction. In other words, most people do not go to the movies by themselves, nor do they consider a film's convention in isolation, a vacuum. Instead, moviegoers typically discuss with family and friends the film content, its visual convention, and its social impacts, as films permeate through our thoughts and action. Here enters an important social and political characteristic of the moviegoer and the projection of his or her political and moral values to the communication and the dialogue with the film's convention. A theory of identification. How do we best describe and explain relationship between the moviegoer and the world presented on the screen? This question is central to this work, as I attempt to present cinema as a tool uncovering various experiences across different lines in order to imagine some uncommon ground. In film theory, the event of the moviegoer transcending space so as to enter the world being depicted on screen is called identification. Balaz 53, Dart 76. And while the research on identification is not new, it commands wide acceptance and is of considerable value in explaining the importance of film. Identification theory suggests that a moviegoer experiences vicariously but deeply the events of the story, the setting, the characters that are portrayed on screen. That is, the viewer puts him or herself in the place of the character or emphasizes with one of the characters in his or her circumstance. Linton, 1982. Andrew Tudor in The Film and the Measurement of Its Effects, 1969. Suggests a 4-point model of identification that includes an emotional affinity where the audience feels a loose attachment to a particular protagonist, a self-identification where the individual sees himself or herself on the screen rather than the actor, either a similarity or wishful thinking identification. 3. Imitation where the identification moves outside the immediate cinema-going experience. And 4. A projection where the viewer lives his or her life in terms that are implicit with the favored protagonist. Nick Bounce in The Spectre in the Text, Rhetoric of Stagecoach, 1976, sharpens this model by explaining identification in a triangular fashion. The spectator position, the camera point of view, and a character's perspective. Of importance to this work, it is an emphasis on the social and cultural context that informs and helps shape the notion of perspective. Brown continues with an expansion of the notion of identification by addressing identification with a character's position in a certain situation. He writes, "The way we as spectators are implicated in the action is much more a matter of our position with respect to the unfolding of those events in time as to their representation from the point in space." 76, page 219. Thus, in order for cinema to be used as a tool for social and political analysis, we need to understand as much as possible the process and implications of identification, the language of film, and the conventions of film with a particular social cultural context that involves an understanding and viewing experience and how it can possibly affect the moviegoer. Cinema and films are often devalued by the social scientists because of the perception that films are light, somewhat frivolous, value neutral, and socially and politically innocent experiences that allow people to escape from their everyday lives. Linton, 1982, page 192. But it is exactly this understanding or feel for film that allows the filmgoer to relax and enter a receptive state where he or she may become susceptible to the new attitudes and opinions that dealt with difference in a way that may transform one's sensibilities and allow for a connection of the one kind of experience with another. A critique of the assumption suggests that dealing differently with difference in this matter is nothing more than manipulation through the employ of propaganda. I question this critique when it is applied to films that aim to give voice at uncovering stories, and those have been silenced and repressed by a dominant cultural hegemony, a dominant we society. For example, there are thousands of films that have been produced to shore up the U.S. anti-communist sentiment, to perpetrate and protract racial divisions, and most notably the Western, and to reaffirm negative stereotypes of women and homosexuals. Films that challenge the context of these dominant texts aim at telling specific stories differently, gay, of color, female, only enrich our understanding of their condition and move us closer to a point of mutual recognition and connection. Connection, a theory of identification to political theory, film as argument. Satya Mohanty's work directed at identifying genuine cultural differences and similarities across difference lines by uncovering and recognizing the importance of experiences and what he refers to as raw materials. These constructed of identity is enhanced by the inclusion of cinema, a theory of identification. Coupling his realist theory of identity with film's criticism and theory better defines how various identities reshape our values and collective futures. So, in asking the question, what is the relationship between the moviegoer and the worlds of others presented on the screen, and depending on the world or conventions of the film, we position ourselves to uncover that which is purely of individual affair, our collective experiences. Alastair McIntyre suggesting that we are always co-authors of our own narrative underscores the cinema-going experience, specifically the power of film to transcendence of space by the moviegoer to the world on screen, whether it is to be the world of John Singleton's Rosewood, USA 97, or Steven Spielberg's Nazi Germany 1994. Both films allow the moviegoer to transcend space to a point in history where the exclusionary practices and the injustices met by the people living on the margins come to light. Identification by some moviegoers with the events, the story, the setting, the characters portrayed on screen often can effectively serve as a recognition to the experience that may have been forgotten, suppressed, or simply not known. The co-authorship or co-ownership of the narrative, as referred to by McIntyre and to a certain extent Baldwin and Wright, may then be discovered to be a thing shared somewhat in common among people who may have thought their lives entirely different and exclusive. Whether the film goer identifies with protagonist, antagonist, or merely the values and norms of a specific time period, the identification illustrates how much our lives intersect and inform how we can begin to connect one kind of experience with another. Mohanty writes, to others who might be shared experience, we need to reconstruct what our relevant community might have been and appreciate the social and historical dimensions of our innermost selves. Mohanty, 1993, page 60. This does not suggest, nor do I mean to imply, that we will always come upon or uncover localized shared experiences. Rather, James Baldwin and June Jordan, when referring to an American experience, have suggested that these complex African American experiences, an experience often invaded by violence, poverty, police violence, black and black crime, and the political economy of drugs, the deterioration of a country's urban infrastructure has intersected the experience of white America. In other words, a shared experience is not necessarily an exclusively local one, nor it is a cast as an identical one growing up in the South, living in a poverty-stricken urban corridor, or growing up gay in the heartland. I suspect that the point of connection, if it were to be revealed, would not be grounded in a love of the nation, a particular respect of truth, and thus a particular set of democratic procedures. Rather, the point of connection might be found in a shared sense of doubt, uncertainty, or fear, or alienation, or unfulfillment. Hence, a recognition by those who are not gay, not of color, not female, or not lives, resides in the marginals of the contributions of our society. While Mohanty does not use cinema, the cinema aids in the endeavor as to give it a certain type of access to these memories and experiences, while noting that we should avoid understanding these memories and experiences as carbon copies of one another. Mohanty is not clear whether he believes that access to various buried experiences across different lines will allow for a reconstruction of a healthy, heterogeneous political community, let alone a community that envisions U.S. democratic politics in ways that both respect and transcend difference lines. Rather, his attention is focused specifically within the identification difference circles, Toni Morrison narrative construction in Beloved, in the recovery of shared experience between Seth and Paul. However, Charles Taylor's focus on the recognition of misrecognition of social and cultural differences suggests the possibility of something distinct, that is, a commonality across different slides, albeit, according to Taylor, constructed through collective dialogues. Baldwin, while not suggesting or arguing for a procedural politics, also suggests work and movement toward a social or cultural identity across different lines as he calls for a deeper knowledge of both black and white experiences. Here, one recognizes the appropriateness of film and the importance of cinema as a vehicle that allows for a sharing of different experiences and a possible connection of one kind of experience with another. Filmmakers from Spike Lee and John Singleton to Jonathan Demme have uncovered human experiences, film experiences aimed at uncovering and remembering stories sometimes with wide appeal that have often been suppressed and forgotten, stories too of difference. Lee and Singleton specifically have answered in an important way Baldwin's charge that white America does not know the experience of Harlem, but should. However, both men have said that the films are not necessary for white audiences. They do not make films for white people, but white moviegoers are not prohibited from viewing their, Lee's and Singleton's films. In essence, both of these filmmakers have uncovered stories that illustrate how black and white, buried, contested, and potentially fused imaginative experiences intersect, albeit within an often hostile racial issue, caste-like structure. The point is, white America often only knows part of the story, the manifest destiny, missionary part, if you will, and therefore has a protracted, distorted view of the other.